Certainly want to thank you too, Mike. And again, I know we have more opportunities to thank you for your service on behalf of the commission and in all the various constituencies, but for your good work and many interactions with Stewardship Council staff and obviously all the various other parties that are that work in the Delta. I wanted just to turn to Leanne and express thanks to her. In fact, she and I were in one of the rural communities in Sacramento County until late last evening, and talking about a variety of very important issues to folks in the rural eastern part of the county. Leanne, just in your talking with colleagues kind of in the planning realm, I think you've reflected certainly on Sacramento County's perspective, and I think the work between council staff and you and Don Thomas and others in Sacramento County. What's your sense amongst your colleagues? Do you have some sense about that? Are they viewing this in a similar fashion? I know there's been a lot of work done, and I think we've heard a lot about covered actions and process and certainty, and again, I think that a lot has resulted in just you stated it, but I'm just curious, have you heard?
I can't say that I can necessarily represent the opinions of the other jurisdictions. Our meetings have been focused on the relationship between how Sacramento County is going to function and working with Dan Ray and his staff, focused on our local community. So I'm not sure if Don Thomas has more interactions with some of those, but I can't say that I'm representing the other.
I wasn't expecting to. I just but they're kind of similar held views. I mean, maybe Dan or Cindy could weigh in. I mean, because again, we're one of 5 counties, and there are cities as well, and other planning agencies, I guess.
Yeah, I think it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Sacramento is unique, I think, because of the legacy communities along Highway 160 and the focus y'all have had on those over a long time. Recognizing their both kind of fragile nature and the cool things about them. I think all most of the counties, maybe San Joaquin, a bit of an exception, have done a focus primarily on locating development in the existing urban areas to protect farmlands. And so I think in most cases we've got basic land use patterns that we all are going, hey, this is going to work out. I don't have a lot of conflicts over that. I think there is a apprehension, depending on how much time folks have spent understanding the process with the certification process. I think that's going down as we talk with people more and more. So I think y'all and Contra Costa are the most comfortable. YOLO, I think, is becoming more comfortable. I think Solano doesn't have much area that has development within the Delta. San Joaquin County, because they have over time had quite a bit of development of farmlands and have been changing land use designations from agriculture to accommodate development. I think they're less comfortable with the situation today, and Stockton as well, despite our attempts to explain to them how the program works and why we think it is not going to be a threat to them. I think all the locals see the importance of coordinating around very big things that happen infrequently, HCPs being the most recent example. And so whether you're an agency that's already got an HCP approved, like San Joaquin or the 3 counties that are developing them now, everybody sees those as, these are going to be covered actions, and this is a big thing, we have to get this right. And this question of interaction between local land use plans and the BDCP that Mr. Machado brought up is also a constant theme in conversations about those issues. I think that's one of the other things that we've heard from local governments.
Judge?
This is a question I have for each of you on the panel. From your agency's perspective, what is your understanding of the role and authority of the Stewardship Council?
Our understanding is that the local agency has the ability to determine what is a covered action in consultation with the Stewardship Council, with the DSC staff, that we can do that within the parameters of our legacy communities, our local towns, and things that are consistent with our general plan. But items that may be converting farmland to an urban use that would not be covered in our general plan. Those kinds of things would not be consistent with the plan. So that's...
Right, but and I
really
understand
similar.
that. I mean, I think I understood that. But what do you think our role is, and what our authority is vis-a-vis your agency?
Right. So I guess my understanding is that if we were doing something that is inconsistent, then your role would be to point that out and
To make that observation?
to make that observation. And
Anything
Yeah.
else?
I think it does go beyond that if it's inconsistent.
What is your understanding? If you had, I'm not
Yeah.
sure that's fine too, but.
Yeah, I guess I'm not entirely sure what happens when it's completely inconsistent,
Okay.
when there's an inconsistency.
Mr. Weber?
Well, I think your authority doesn't subsume the state water board's authority. I mean, we still have our direct authorities, which aren't affected by the Delta Stewardship Council, and yet I think that there's positive effect in terms of how the connectedness of those things, and you pointing to other things that might depend, for example, on our flow objectives and require a consistency determination based in part on achieving certain water quality objectives, things like that. So I see there's an interrelationship between the Delta Stewardship Council and the State Water Board with regard to that. And overall, I see it as much more a collaborative, well, the things that we don't do, how do we show that they're getting done between the authorities that you do have.
Judge, I think you're similar to the DPC in terms of being able to appeal items or projects that are not consistent with the Delta plan. I think you have a charge for coordination, but you have that coordination without enforcement across agencies, and I think that's what leads to the difficulty of being able to see some success in this. And you have the covered actions. But in essence, you have the opportunity for oversight without correction.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Grover?
Yes.
Ms. Messer? Excuse me, Ms. Moffitt.
Yeah, I'm busily reading here, and that appears to be the case, so yes.
Right. Thank you.
And if I add, I think it's actually a very important role, because, and again, if I say this too much, I always feel bad for the typical concerned citizen or even the agency that wants to be involved and do good in the Delta, because it's hard to know where to begin to do that good, because there's too much of this going on. So to the extent that you can provide clarity and show that we are all pulling together, I think that that's an invaluable role, even though you might not have the strong, clear authorities to pound and make it happen.
Okay.
Any other council comments? Mr. Johnson?
First, I too will miss you, Mike, in your role. You have certainly assisted in our collective efforts, everyone involved in rethinking how we solve water problems and environmental problems, and with particular attention to the Delta itself. And you have a long record of involvement and contribution, and it will certainly continue. And your law on standards for flood protection will guide this state maybe for the next 90 years in some respects. So thank you for that. Your first comment made me think of something else, which was you referenced the Bay Delta Authority, which was sort of the oversight body created by CalFed, as an authority without any authority. Some of the continuing response we get to the Delta Plan argues that we don't have any authority and we shouldn't have any authority. Having served on that body, as you did, I'm aware of what happens when you only have the ability to call a meeting, ask for cooperation, and try and coordinate. So our Delta plan is a mix of many recommendations without the force of law and some specific policies that we intend to see are enforced towards the objective of the co-equal goals. So thanks for that implicit acknowledgement of where we're headed. But on the topic at hand is implementation, as we, the council, move from plan to making things work. And there were a couple of buckets that you referenced, and one was a list of projects that has been developed over time that have wide consensus or support, and what happens to that. And you suggested, if I understand your testimony correctly, is that what perhaps blocks their implementation is the local cost component. And I suppose that differs for whatever project, although if there's a local cost component, it implies that the locals are a beneficiary too. So maybe have a cost responsibility. But the other one was a suggestion that delay is occurring because there's a larger strategy to wait until BDCP comes, and that progress in the interim undermines a big solution that is controversial. So I don't know whether to give that any weight or not, but it would seem to me that our task is to look at that list, have all the stakeholders, including local counties and certainly the Delta Protection Commission, and work through that list. And even if our role is coordinating in those aspects and doesn't have the power to make people do things, that we do move on those lists. Randy, is that how you see, at least in part, what we should be doing?
Yes. Yes, in placing priorities after evaluating those lists.
I didn't mean to suggest that locals shouldn't be participating in the local cost. There is a challenge to local agencies to coming up with the full local cost. And in a recent project that was done in San Joaquin County, which was reinforcement of Lower Jones Track and where East Bay Mud runs the aqueduct, the locals participated, but East Bay Mud came in and fulfilled the gap that allowed them to go ahead and do that. And it was those type of partnerships that we're going to be looking at to be pursued to be able to improve some of the conveyance reliability as well as habitat. And it's in those discussions in these groups, we get up to the point where we're at the water trough, and then there's a hesitation to drink.
Okay, so noted. The other bucket that you referenced is the tension between protecting delta agriculture and creating more habitat. And while there are projects that integrate both, this argument has been going on at least for the 20 years of the existence of the Delta Protection Commission, and won't ever be fully resolved. The economic sustainability plan that the Commission had done, and which you graciously acknowledged we incorporated parts, although not all of it in it, I think emphasizes agriculture because it's quantifiable. There's an economic activity that you can measure, And so if you reduce agriculture, you're reducing economic activity and you're affecting presumably the economy of the Delta region, and and there's an implicit negative associated with that. Our responsibilities from a statewide perspective include, though, habitat sufficient with other strategies to restore fisheries and the Delta environment. And in some cases, that will come into conflict with the de facto higher priority of the Delta Protection Commission and the constituencies in the Delta that see agriculture as more important than habitat. It seems to me that the Delta Protection Commission, over the length of its history, has performed a very constructive function, and I would hope in implementation, and that's the point here, it could be an important partner with the Council in resolving where and how habitat projects happen in the Delta. And I know when Margaret Arambaru had your position, she worked a lot with both those who were farmers who were on the Delta Protection Commission and others to try and figure out how to accommodate projects or sometimes move projects or create buffers so that the habitat project didn't interfere with a neighboring farming operation. We could argue the theory, but I think the implementation job is to try and find as many occasions that the expertise that the Commission represents of local people can be put to good use in the larger charge that we have, and that is to do habitat where it has to be done. To some degree, and you referenced it, you can farm asparagus or tomatoes in various places. Some habitats have to go in portions of the Delta, and they can't be moved elsewhere.
Well, as you may recall, the Commission has been working on a working landscapes project, which was to incorporate habitat projects within ongoing farming operations. I don't mean to suggest that you are going to eliminate the type of situations that you're asking. What is lacking is the dialogue, where a couple of things. One is define. There isn't they need to define where they want to place this habitat. You put an overlay. You also define what you want to achieve with respect to that habitat. Then you go out and you talk to the landowners or the practitioners and saying, these are the goals and objectives that we have. This is where we think it's going to work. How can we do this, or what suggestions do you have that can help us meet these goals that may be different than what we're proposing, but we still get to the same spot? That type of dialogue engages, and it also brings in generations of practicing in the Delta to be able to do that. That's not taking place. It appears to the person sitting there farming in an island that somebody's coming in and dumping on them without that option. And that's part of what I've taken away from the committee meetings I've been asked to be a part of, where we've talked about how do we do restoration in the farmland. And if we don't have that dialogue, you create a credibility problem, and you also generate resistance. And I think our mutual goals, and yes, is to try to overcome both of that to meet the objectives of restoring the Delta. We can cooperate with the Council, and the Commission is more than willing to. But if you have an agency over here that is non-responsive to the Council or to the Commission that's carrying out their activities, then the credibility of the Council is going to be jeopardized, not because of what the actions you're doing, but by the actions of others. And that's the bridge that needs to be built that's not there.
Let me just, I hope we can build that bridge. I think that was that was the idea that I understood. One of the principal ideas of why we exist is do just that. And you're saying that we're not doing it sufficiently at this time, or that other parties are just going to make it impossible for us to do that?
Judge, I think that's part of the gap that exists between the powers that have been conferred by the legislation to the council and the powers that have not been conferred by the legislation to the council for interaction with the multitude of other agencies that believe they have a stake in the Delta.
I just want to add one. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that we go back a long ways. Before you were in the legislature, and you've been a wonderful leader and a legislator, and obviously you've done an excellent role, done an excellent job in the role that you have now, and so I wish you the best. I didn't know this was the first and last time we would encounter one another in this job. I don't know whether I should be happy or sad about that. But in any event, I wish you the best, Mike.
Thank you, Judge.
Gloria?
Mr. Machado, I wanted to first thank you for your input that you've provided to the council over the last 2 years. It's been invaluable. Some of the concerns and some of the things that you've said today, hopefully they can be worked out in the implementation process, because I think it really has to do with the spirit of cooperation, because everyone on this panel certainly are in this room and have been involved in the plan know that the council is not an enforceable agency, and I think the judge asked a very important question, and the authority of the council and the role, which that has kind of been the overriding theme for a lot of discussion here. But the plan is enforceable, and I think the council can certainly take the lead in terms of bringing together agencies who do have jurisdiction over the Delta. However, we cannot enforce those policies that will become regulations, but hopefully we can facilitate, we can encourage cooperation from those agencies that do have the authority to make things happen. So I think the implementation committee and the ad hoc work group will be essential to the success of this plan, and hopefully the council and the plan will be perceived as a little more successful in CalFed. And I don't really know what happened in CalFed, but what I have learned in terms of being one of the council members that I think is very important when we started this whole process was to ensure that we had stakeholder input, and that has been crucial, from agencies, from folks who have a stake in the Delta, that they really be a part, feel like they're a part of whatever this plan has been developed to be. However, there's still some issues that are still lingering, but I think that folks can at least say that they have been part of the process, and the council has heard the concerns, and the council has allowed the opportunity for people to provide input. So I say to all of you that the implementation process is just as important as adopting the plan. And so your role, agency's role, all of us will be crucial in the spirit of cooperation to make sure that, the plan is successful as we move forward. So thank you for your input for the last years. Hopefully you will stay involved, and thank you, all of you, for your presentation this morning. But I do want to say that this process, this implementation process, will be very, very important. And so hopefully things will be worked out at the ad hoc work group level and the process as we move forward.
Don?
I just wanted to add, I think certainly in light of some of the responses that Mike's given to some of the questions both Patrick asked, but also I think just in his comments, and I think to maybe put another exclamation point behind, I think this whole thing with relative credibility and trust. And I think over the last couple of weeks, some of the revelations that have come out in the newspaper as relates to agencies who may or may not have shared anything as it relates to certain aspects of BDCP, which has a relationship obviously with the Delta Plan under the Reform Act. And again, this is not to be to take a point with any particular state agency, but with Caltrans and more recently with EWR's conversations with obviously parties that are very deeply engaged in the BDCP process about certain aspects of construction and movement of roads and so forth. I can tell you that does significant damage with folks both locally and local agencies as it relates to folks having either assumed authorities and or presumed authorities or the designated authorities to do that. And then where the council's role would have any impact on that because of this supportive role versus enforcement role. And that is the type of thing that just continues to, I think, damage the ability to have, I think, any fruitful conversations regarding habitat restoration, about impacts as it relates to construction projects or movement of water or achieving co-equal goals, because it goes to the heart of, obviously, the Delta, not only as a place, but its viability, the community's viabilities. And I guess I would just, Mike, is there anything else you wanted to add on? Because I think those two things in recent weeks where there's been conversations, side conversations, or as part of formal processes where, again, this council hasn't had a role in those, and yet at some point in time, BDCP may very well be presented to this council for its conformity, consistency with the Delta plan, and yet you've got entities that go off and do things, and people read about them long before they ever hear about them from somebody who might actually have a conversation with them. And I think the agricultural example is a very fine example of that too, where they'll say, well, we're going to take care of that, but they aren't talking with the stakeholders about it. And so I don't know if anything else you can add to it, Mike, but I mean, I thought it was, again, you talked about it in a more general sense, but I mean, those are examples that I certainly have heard significant feedback about in recent weeks. And I think this tend to highlight the whole conversation about the bigger issue of even habitat and how you attain credibility with folks.
I think what I can add is the good work that the plan has, and acknowledging that there's a lot of things, a lot of people will take issues with things. There's things that are good in it that will be consensus. That plan gets jeopardized by the very things you were talking about. And that's I think what lacks in the legislation, the ability for the council to do more than just coordinate. And that's the same challenge we faced 20 years ago with CalFed. And as that evolved. And we kind of waited long enough. We kind of waited long enough to really get to trying to address not the water problem in general in California, the mechanics of the distribution, and the recognition of the uniqueness of the Delta, not only to the water system in California, but in terms of what it is geographically, environmentally, and ecologically. We've got to the point of being able to do something, and I just hope we don't fall back.
Chris Stevens, you had something you'd like to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a finer point, and I really appreciate all the efforts that you've put into the Delta, and you were one of our strongest critics in the CalFed era, and your criticisms were pretty accurate. We didn't have oversight authority. We didn't have teeth. But I just wanted to put a finer point on the conversation, because I think that the council members' questions about authority are relevant, because we right now do have an ongoing regulatory process that we're trying to wrap up, and we're actually trying to adopt our plan shortly. So this is all very pertinent. There's a big difference between this council and the Delta plan and what the Bay Delta Authority had in its arsenal. And it turns out it didn't have much in its arsenal except a bully pulpit and a dwindling supply of money that kind of snowballed. This council does have the consistency, determination, and appellate role, which is the big difference. And it is something that we should not take lightly. So the idea that this council is not an enforcement entity should perhaps be nuanced. The Delta plan is required to be a legally enforceable plan. Parts of it will be a legally enforceable plan. We've spent now 2.5 years coming up with kind of a hybrid, moderate approach to solving what the legislature told us was a crisis. We're getting prepared shortly to adopt regulations that will add that legal enforceability component. But the idea that proposed projects that are inconsistent with a Delta plan's regulation can then go forward, and that our role is just to identify inconsistencies is, in my view, my strong view, incorrect. Because there would be no point in having this body do what it's done in terms of adopting a Delta plan, a legally enforceable Delta plan. So that, I think, is a strong point that we have to remember as the debate goes forward, especially in May, with regard to our authority. A finer point, though, that all of the panelists raised was relevance, credibility. That's key. So I think as staff, we're aware of that. The council members are aware of that. We have to engage with the agencies to make sure in our coordination role, as well as our oversight through our appellate role, that things get done. But there is a big difference between the Bay Delta Authority and CalFed and where we're at now. So,
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Chris, I wanted to just say thank you for bringing up the fact that the council does have the appellate role. So thank you very much. That is important to know.
Well, my concern is sometimes perception is more important than reality. The perception out there is the opposite of what I heard just now. I think we need to correct that.
yeah, and it's always important to actually define what implementation of the Delta plan means, because we, as the council, are not going to be implementing the significant part of the plan, and our partners are. So you're absolutely right. But I think that what they've identified is important for the entire state. So in my own view, the idea that we're just an entity that identifies issues and hopes that other agencies get things done, I think Les Grober hit it right. He was right on point that we have to, as were you, Chair Fiorini, we have to identify the agencies that need to do things and make sure that they're accountable to get them done. And that's what we have to do. That's what I think the citizens of the state expect of us. So perception's important. Authority is key. There is a difference, and we'll work to get it done.
Very good. Panelists, you have helped to better understand the issues that your agencies are concerned about. You've offered some suggestions about how we might interact and work together more cooperatively and productively. We thank you.
And then our